The wind off the Saskatchewan prairie doesn't ask permission. It comes from the northwest in October, like something that's been building anger all summer, and it hits the open fields with a sound like a freight train that never arrives. Elmer Kowalski had heard that sound every autumn of his 51 years, and he had learned, the way a man learns things that cost him, that the land remembers every mistake you make against it. Elmer stood at the edge of his north field on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of morning where the frost hadn't quite left the grass by 9 o'clock. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders but thin in the way that outdoor work makes a person thin. Not the thinness of deprivation but of constant use, muscles worn smooth like river stone. His hair had gone the color of winter wheat, and his face carried the particular weathering of someone who had spent decades squinting into wind and sun. He had his father's jaw, square and stubborn, and his mother's eyes, which were the pale gray blue of the sky just before snow. His hands, resting on the top rail of the fence, were large and calloused and certain. He was looking at his father's land. Alois Kowalski had farmed these 480 acres outside Kindersley for 37 years before his heart quit on him during the canola harvest of 2019. He had died the way he would have chosen, in the cab of his combine, in August, with the crop coming in clean. Elmer had found him there, slumped against the window, looking almost peaceful, the GPS guidance still pulling the machine in slow, careful lines through the field. Elmer had sat beside his father for a long time before he called anyone. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe he thought his father might have something else to say. The land Alois left behind was good land, or had been. The north and west quarters were still producing, but the south 80, the piece that caught the prevailing winds directly, had been struggling for 6 years running. Yields were down. Topsoil was thinning. After a hard rain, the runoff carried red-brown water down the slope and into the road ditch, and Elmer would stand at his kitchen window watching it go, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not guilt, exactly, more like witness. He was still paying the operating loan his father had taken in 2017. He had a 15-year-old daughter named Petra who wanted to study environmental science in Saskatchewan. He had a 2011 pickup with 240,000 kilometers on it. He had 480 acres that needed to earn their keep and a South 80 that was losing ground, literally, every single year. He had also, 3 weeks before, driven 2.5 hours to attend a soil health conference in Swift Current, where he had spent an afternoon listening to a retired agronomist from the University of Manitoba talk about windbreaks. The man's name was Walter Primrose, 68 years old, compact and unhurried, with white hair cut close, and the careful diction of someone who had spent a long career being precise. He had shown slides of farms across the prairies, farms that had planted deliberate rows of trees along their field margins. And he had talked about what those trees did that nobody credited them for. They slowed the wind. They held the snow. They reduced evaporation in summer. They broke the force of rain on bare soil. Their falling leaves, year after year, added organic matter back to ground that annual cropping perpetually stripped. They created microclimates. They sheltered pollinators. They gave the land something to lean against. Walter had called it a shelter belt. Elmer had heard the word before. His grandfather had spoken of them. The tree rows planted across Saskatchewan in the 30s, when the drought and the wind had stripped the topsoil down to hardpan across half the province. But somewhere between his grandfather's generation and his father's, the shelter belts had come out. The machinery got bigger, and bigger machinery needed unbroken fields. Trees were an obstacle. Trees were inefficient. Trees were the past. Elmer had sat in the back row of that conference room and listened to Walter talk for 90 minutes, and he had felt something shifting in him, slow and tectonic, the way belief moves when it finally decides to move. He had driven home in the dark with the radio off, thinking. His neighbor, a man named Phil Dirksen who farmed the section to the east and whose family had been in the area since 1908, stopped by the following week. Phil was 63, a large and deliberate man with a gray mustache and opinions that had been forming since the Trudeau years. He came to the door with a dozen eggs from his wife and the particular expression of someone who has heard something concerning. "Heard you were at that conference in Swift Current," Phil said. "I was," Elmer said. "Heard some of those university types were pushing shelter belts again." Phil said, "University types, the way some men say lawyers. Not with hostility, exactly. With the protective skepticism of someone who has watched a lot of ideas blow through and knows that the land doesn't care about ideas." Walter Primrose was there. Retired Manitoba agronomist. "I know who Walter Primrose is," Phil said. "He's been pushing shelter belts since 1995. Didn't work then either." Elmer didn't argue. He wasn't built for argument. He said, "Want some coffee?" And Phil came in, and they sat at the kitchen table for an hour and talked about other things, the way men in that part of the world do. And when Phil left, Elmer stood at the window and looked out at his South 80 and thought about what his grandfather had said once, when Elmer was about 8 years old. His grandfather, a man named Josef, had come over from Poland in 1952 and had broken ground near Kindersley with almost nothing. Josef had told Elmer, in the halting but precise English he had worked his whole life to perfect, "The land is not your property. It is your responsibility. There is a difference. Property you can do with what you like. Responsibility you answer for." Elmer had been 8. He had mostly been thinking about supper, but the words had gone somewhere they couldn't be retrieved. And now, 43 years later, standing at a kitchen window in October, they came back to him with the full weight of what they meant. He ordered the trees in November, through the Prairie Shelter Belt Program, a federal initiative that most of his neighbors had never heard of or had dismissed as a government make-work scheme. Elmer arranged for seedlings to be delivered the following spring. He planned 4 rows along the southern and western margins of his South 80, the edges most exposed to the prevailing northwest wind. The innermost row would be silver buffalo berry and hawthorn, dense and low, to catch the snow and slow the wind at ground level. Second row, white spruce, which grew slowly but lived for a century. Third row, green ash, faster growing, filling in the canopy. Outermost row, hybrid poplar, tall and quick, a first shield against the wind while the others established. He showed the plan to Petra one evening at the kitchen table. She was 15, with her mother's dark hair and his own tendency toward quietness. Already collecting university brochures and watching soil erosion videos on her phone, with the intense focus of someone who had already decided something. She studied the diagram for a long time. Then she said, "How many acres does this take out of production?" "About 6.5, he said. She looked up. "You can afford that?" He wasn't sure, he said. "I think I can afford less." She didn't ask what he meant. She was her father's daughter. In April, the seedlings arrived on a flat-deck trailer, 640 trees, ranging from knee-height to waist-height, bundled in burlap and waiting with the indifferent patience of things that have time on their side. Elmer and Petra planted them over 4 days, working methodically down the rows, using a transplanting bar to open the soil and pressing each root mass in carefully, firming the earth with a boot heel. It was cold work, the wind still cutting in April, the ground just soft enough to accept the roots. Elmer's back ached by the end of each day. He did not complain about this. He was not someone who complained about physical work. Phil Dirksen drove past on the 3rd day and slowed his truck, watching them. He didn't stop. But that evening, Elmer heard from Gordon Tessier, who farmed the quarter to the north, that Phil had said at the coffee shop in town that Elmer Kowalski was putting trees back into his fields. The way Phil had reportedly said it carried a particular inflection. Not quite contemptuous, but close. The inflection of someone who considers a thing already decided. By May, word had moved through the community the way word moves in small farming communities, which is to say everywhere and faster than you'd expect. At the elevator one afternoon, A man Elmer knew only slightly, a younger farmer from outside Estone named Curtis Webb, stopped him in the parking lot. Curtis was 31, confident, farming 3 sections with the newest equipment, and he had the expression of someone delivering news he considered inevitable. "Here you planted trees on your South 80, Curtis said. "That's right," Elmer said. "Losing 6 acres of production. About that." Curtis shook his head slowly, not unkindly, in the manner of a man who has done math in his head and found it simple. "At current canola prices, 6 acres over 10 years is a number that adds up," he said. Elmer looked at him for a moment. "So does losing topsoil," he said. Curtis didn't have an answer for that, and Elmer didn't wait for one. He loaded his truck and drove home. The summer of that first year was neither good nor bad. The trees were small and offered nothing yet. They sat in their rows looking fragile and slightly absurd against the scale of the prairie, which is a landscape that does not easily accommodate things that are new and tentative. Elmer irrigated them twice in July during a dry stretch, hauling water out in a tank and doing it by hand, row by row. It took him most of 2 days. Petra helped on the Saturday, working without talking much, which was the way she helped best. The South 80 that year came in at 34 bushels per acre on canola. His north field hit 49. The difference was wind and water retention, and Elmer knew it. But he knew also that 640 knee-high trees were not going to demonstrate that this season. In September, Phil Dirksen came to the door again. He had heard the South 80 numbers at the elevator. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he looked out the window toward the tree rows, and he said, not unkindly, "Elmer, you're a patient man, but those trees aren't doing a thing for you yet, and you've lost 6 acres for them." "They're doing things I can't measure yet," Elmer said. Phil looked at him with the expression of a man who respects someone while believing they are wrong. He said, "Your dad farmed this land for 37 years without trees." Elmer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather farmed his land for 20 years without trees, and then the 30s came, and he watched his topsoil blow to Manitoba. He always said that was the worst thing he ever saw. Worse than the money, watching the land go." Phil didn't argue after that, but he also didn't look convinced. The second year, the hybrid poplars grew 1.5 meters. The green ash leafed out thick and early. The white spruce moved more slowly, as spruce do, putting their energy underground, building root systems that would outlast everyone in the conversation. The buffalo berry and hawthorn developed the dense interlocking structure they were planted to create. By midsummer, the outer rows of the shelter belt were tall enough to be visible from the road, a green line across the south margin of Elmer's land that hadn't been there before. Petra took photographs for a school project on land reclamation. She interviewed her father for it, recording him on her phone at the kitchen table, asking careful questions she had prepared in a notebook. She was 16 now, with a way of listening that suggested she already knew the answers, but wanted to hear how he would say them. "Why did you decide to do this?" she asked. Elmer thought about it. He said, "Because the land was telling me something and I'd been too busy not listening." She wrote that down. She got an A on the project. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Thiessen, who had taught agricultural science in Kindersley for 22 years, sent Elmer a note through Petra saying it was one of the better pieces of environmental thinking she had seen from a student, and that he had raised someone who understood that the world was long and human plans were short. He kept that note. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because most of what he heard from people that year carried the opposite implication. Gordon Tessier, who was not unkind but had strong views on land use and the efficiency of prairie farming, said at a community meeting that spring that he worried about the precedent. Trees near field margins created problems: root competition, equipment access, wildlife habitat in the wrong places. He wasn't criticizing Elmer directly. He was speaking in generalities. But the room knew who he was talking about, and Elmer knew, and nobody said anything one way or the other. There was a woman at that meeting named Irene Pasquayak, who farmed 60 kilometers south and had driven up to attend specifically because she had heard there was going to be a discussion about shelter belt planting. She was 58, with straight black hair going silver, a member of the Sweetgrass First Nation, and she had been farming certified organic grain for 18 years, on land her family had held since before the reserves were drawn. She said, quietly and without particular emphasis, that her grandfather had told her about the tree rows the Crown had removed from reservation land in the 60s, when the government decided unbroken fields were modern. She said he had never stopped talking about what that had cost the soil. The room was quiet for a moment after she said it. Then someone asked about the new herbicide trial, and the meeting moved on. Elmer drove home that night, thinking about what Irene had said. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about how certain knowledge gets removed from a landscape along with the things that hold it, and how many generations it takes before someone has to learn it again from scratch. He thought about Joseph arriving from Poland in 1952, knowing nothing, starting from nothing, making mistakes and surviving them. He thought about his father in the cab of the combine. He thought about the way the South 80 had been bleeding its topsoil downslope for 6 years before he had done anything about it. He went to bed that night feeling small in the way that farmland makes you feel small when you pay attention, not crushed, but properly sized. It was a feeling he trusted. The third year, something happened that nobody anticipated. The winter of that year brought heavy snow in November and December, and the shelter belt, now nearly 2 meters at its outer row, caught the drifts. The snow accumulated on the lee side of the trees in deep, curving drifts that persisted well into March. When the melt came in April, slow and steady the way prairie melts go, that water didn't run off. It soaked in. The South 80 retained moisture through May and June, while the fields to the east and west of Elmer's land were already showing stress in the dry spell that arrived in July. His canola on the South 80 came in at 41 bushels per acre. Not remarkable, not exceptional, but 7 bushels better than the year before, in a drier year, on ground that had been losing yield for 6 consecutive seasons before he planted the trees. Elmer did not say anything to anyone about this for several weeks. He was not a man who announced things. He did his math privately and sat with the numbers and thought about what they meant. The trees were 3 years old. The outer rows were still filling in. The white spruce were barely a meter tall. This was the beginning of something. Not the middle, not the end. But he had seen enough to know the beginning was real. Phil came over that September, as he had every September since they were neighbors. He sat at the kitchen table, and Elmer told him the South 80 number. And Phil was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the tree rows, which were visible now from the kitchen as a solid green edge along the south margin of the farm. 41, Phil said. 41, Elmer confirmed. Phil was quiet a moment longer. He was not a man who shifted his ground easily, but he was also not a man who refused to look at numbers. He said, finally, "Dry year, driest July we've had in 8 years," Elmer said. Phil picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. He said, "My southwest field came in at 33. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, the wind was starting up, that low northwest tone that arrived in September like something returning from a long journey. The hybrid poplars at the south end of Elmer's field were swaying in a line, their movement synchronized, bending and recovering the way things bend and recover when they have roots deep enough to trust. Phil put his cup down. He said, "Those poplars are getting big." "They are," Elmer said. Phil looked at him for a moment, and Elmer saw something working in his neighbor's face. Not capitulation, but something more honest than that. The particular expression of a man who had been watching and was beginning to understand what he'd been watching. Phil said, "How much does it cost to get a shelter belt set up like yours?" The 4th year brought a change Elmer had not planned for. Petrissa was accepted into the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. She had applied in December, and the letter came in February. And she held it in the kitchen for a moment before she called him in from the equipment shed, where he was doing preventive maintenance on the cedar. He came in still holding a wrench, oil on his hands, and she handed him the letter, and he read it standing in the kitchen with his coat still on. He felt proud in the particular wordless way of a man who doesn't entirely know how to say things, but feels them fully. He also felt the farm shift slightly in his thinking. 480 acres, and him alone on it, in the fall, in the spring, in the long stretches between. But that was a calculation for later. Some things earned their space in the future before you were ready to think about them. He handed the letter back. He said, "Well, that's good." She looked at him for a moment and she said, "I'm coming back." He looked at her. He said, "I know." She went in September. The farm got quiet in the particular way that farms get quiet when someone who has been present in them is suddenly absent, not silent, but differently sounded. Elmer worked. He checked the tree rows in the evenings, walking the windward side, and then the sheltered side, noticing the difference in soil temperature, the way the dried leaves from the previous autumn had accumulated in the lee, and were beginning to break down into something dark and fragrant. He noticed where the deer had bedded under the green ash, their oval depressions in the leaf litter. He noticed that the buffalo berry was thick enough, now that he couldn't see through it from the road. He called Petra on Sundays. She was studying soil microbiology and watershed management, and she had professors whose names she mentioned the way students do when a person has shifted something in them. She told him about a study on prairie shelter belt carbon sequestration, and he listened and said, because he was not a man who said much on the phone, but he was writing things down as she talked. The fifth autumn arrived with the kind of weather Saskatchewan produces when it wants to remind you of its options. It started in August, which was wrong. August should be hot and settled, the crop filling out, the land holding its breath before harvest. But that August a weather system came down from the northwest and stalled, and it brought wind. Not rain, which might have been managed. Wind. Sustained 40-kilometer-an-hour winds with gusts past 60 for 8 consecutive days, and the soil was dry because July had been dry. And on the third day of that wind, Elmer stood at his west fence line and watched topsoil move. He had seen it before, in photographs, in his grandfather's stories. But to see it yourself is different from knowing it happens. The dust lifted from the bare field to the west. Curtis Webb's section worked to a fine tilth, no cover between crops, and it moved in brown curtains across the road and settled into anything that would stop it. Fence lines, ditches, the windward side of Elmer's shelter belt. Elmer's South 80 was still standing. The crop was battered but not destroyed. The shelter belt broke the wind along the southern and western margins, dropping wind speed on the lee side by the 40 to 50% that Walter Primrose had described in that conference room in Swift Current. And the canola on Elmer's side of the fence came through the 8 days in something close to one piece. Curtis Webb's west section lost an estimated half-inch of topsoil across 60 acres. The soil science didn't require a laboratory to understand. It had happened in the open, in daylight, across a fence line, side by side. Elmer's land and Curtis's land, similar soil classification, same crop rotation. One with a shelter belt established through 5 years of patience, one without. When the wind quit, Elmer walked his South 80 and stood at the fence line and looked at the difference. He was not a man who experienced satisfaction easily. He was more built for concern than for triumph. But he felt something that afternoon that he recognized as close to vindication, which was not a feeling he was used to, and which he was careful not to let become arrogance. The trees had done what Walter said they would do. They had done it quietly, the way useful things do their work, without announcement, without asking to be noticed, over years, while people were busy deciding whether they were worthwhile. Curtis Webb came over 2 days later. He drove up in the yard and got out of his truck and stood there for a moment, looking toward the tree rows, before he came to the door. Elmer met him on the porch. Curtis was 33 now, 2 years past the confidence of his early 30s, and the wind event had done something to the set of his face. He looked like someone who had been carrying an assumption for a long time, and had just put it down and was noticing how heavy it had been. He said, "That shelter belt of yours held." Elmer said, "It did." Curtis was quiet. He looked at the tree rows for a moment, and then back at Elmer. He said, "I watched it from the road during the wind. Your side and my side. There was a real difference." "There was," Elmer said. Curtis looked at the ground for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily. He was too young for the kind of humility that requires you to have been wrong more than once. But he was also not, Elmer had always sensed, a man who refused to learn. He said, "When you were putting those trees in, I said you were losing 6 acres for nothing." "You did," Elmer said. "I was wrong," Curtis said. Just that. Simple and direct, the way admissions are easiest when a person finally decides to make them. Elmer nodded once. He said, "You want to see the layout?" They walked the shelter belt for an hour. Elmer explaining the spacing, the species selection, the logic of 4 rows in sequence. Short and dense at the inner edge, tall and fast-growing at the outer. He explained the snow retention and the moisture, the leaf fall and the soil organic matter, the way the different species matured on different timelines, so the protection was sustained even as the composition shifted. He explained what Walter Primrose had told him in Swift Current, and the things he had learned since from Petra, and the things he had observed himself over 5 years of walking that fence line. Curtis asked precise questions, the questions of someone already mentally laying this out on their own land. He wanted to know about the federal program, whether it was still available. He wanted to know about root competition and how far back from the crop rows the trees should sit. He wanted to know about equipment access, whether the spacing allowed for a sprayer to work the outer field margin. Elmer answered what he knew and said he'd find out what he didn't. They stood at the south end of the shelter belt, in the early evening, the shadows of the poplars stretching long across the field. The canola had been swathed and was drying in the windrows. The soil on Elmer's side of the fence was intact. On Curtis's side, you could see where the wind had worked. The surface had a faint gullied texture, shallow but real, the kind of thing you notice when you know what to look for. Curtis looked at it for a long time. He said, 5 years. 5 years, Elmer said. I thought you were crazy. I know, Elmer said. He paused. So did Phil Dirksen. Curtis looked at him. What does Phil say now? Phil's putting in 2 rows along his southwest quarter this spring, Elmer said. He called the prairie program in August. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that comes before a smile in a man who doesn't smile easily. He looked back at the tree rows and said, I called them yesterday. Word moves the way it always moves in that part of the world, and by November, the fact that Curtis Webb had applied for a shelter belt program and that Phil Dirksen had applied ahead of him was known at the coffee shop in Kindersley, at the elevator, at the co-op fuel desk. And because both of those men were known and respected in the community, the conversation shifted in the way that conversations shift when respected people change their position, not all at once, not without debate, but in a direction. Gordon Tessier called Elmer in October. He said he had some questions about root competition. Elmer answered them. A younger farmer from outside Dodsland whose name was Mark Haverstock, 28, farming his parents' section for the 2nd year, uncertain in the way of someone very new to a very large responsibility. Drove out unannounced one Saturday morning and stood in the yard and asked Elmer if he could walk the shelter belt, just to see it. Elmer said yes, and they walked it for an hour, and Elmer answered his questions the same way he had answered. Curtis's, without embellishment, without telling Mark what to do, simply describing what he had observed and what the trees had done. Irene Pasquayak called in November and said she was starting a shelter belt restoration project on her land, and wanted to know about Elmer's experience with the federal program. They talked for 40 minutes. She said her grandfather would have been glad to know. Someone in the area was thinking about the long view again. Elmer said he thought a lot of people were probably thinking about it, but hadn't been certain it was permitted. She laughed at that, which was a quiet laugh, considered. And then she said something that stayed with him. She said, "The land has been here a very long time, and it will be here a very long time after us. It doesn't need us to fix it. It needs us to stop breaking it and then get out of the way." Petra came home for Christmas that year. She was taller in some way that wasn't height, some quality of self-possession that university had confirmed rather than installed. She walked the shelter belt on the second day she was home, in her winter coat, boots leaving prints in the snow. The poplars were bare, but the spruce held their dark green through the winter. And the accumulated snow on the lee side was already 3 feet deep along the inner rows, a reservoir that would slowly release into the ground through April and May. Petra walked the rows for a long time, touching branches, crouching to look at something in the snow, looking up through the canopy at the winter sky. Elmer walked beside her but didn't say much, because she wasn't looking at the trees the way someone looks at something they're seeing for the first time. She was looking at them the way someone looks at a thing they have been thinking about from a distance and are now confirming. On the walk back to the house, she said, "The spruce are really establishing now." "They are," he said. She looked at the south field, the stubble from the canola harvest standing in frozen rows. She said, "Your yields came up again this year. 44 bushels on the South 80, he said. She was quiet for a moment. She said 10 bushels per acre above where you were 6 years ago, on a field that was declining. He said, "The trees did that." She looked at him and then back at the trees. She said, "The trees, and you deciding to plant them." He thought about that. He was not a man who accepted credit easily, being built more for the part of the work that comes before the credit. But he recognized that she was making a point that was different from flattery. She was saying that decisions are made by people, and that people who make good decisions in the face of doubt are not accidental. He thought about Joseph in 1952, arriving with nothing and breaking ground in a landscape that did not encourage optimism, learning by loss and patience what the land required. He thought about his father in the combine, who had farmed well but had not had time to see what was happening to the South 80 before his heart gave out. He thought about himself in that conference room in Swift Current, sitting in the back row, feeling something shift. He said, "Your grandfather would have planted them too, I think. He just never got the chance." Petra was quiet beside him. The wind moved through the poplars at the south end of the field, a softer sound than the open field sound, filtered and broken by the rows of trees into something that carried less threat. It sounded less like anger and more like weather, like something that could be worked with, accommodated, acknowledged, given its due. They walked back to the house together, across the field that had taken 5 years to start healing, in the particular late December light of the Saskatchewan prairie that comes in low and gold and brief, touching everything it finds. The trees were not the answer to everything. Farming never has an answer to everything. There were still the operating loans, the input costs, the years when the market moved the wrong way, and the weather agreed with the market. There were still the long February stretches, when the darkness came at 4:30, and the machinery waited in the shop, and the land was sealed under a foot of snow, and there was nothing to do but wait for it. But the South 80 had stopped bleeding. The topsoil was staying where it was put. The snow was banking against the inner rows and releasing slowly in spring, and the spring soil moisture was measurably different from what it had been 6 years before. The canola yields were climbing back toward what they had been when Joseph first broke that ground, and the organic matter in the upper 6 inches of soil had ticked upward for 2 consecutive seasons in the lab results Elmer ordered every 3rd year. These were not dramatic things. They were small things, proceeding slowly in the right direction, the way good things often proceed on the prairie. Without announcement, against the wind, accumulating over time into something that could be stood beside and trusted. The trees were 12 years old in the hybrid poplars, and shorter in the spruce, and longer in the patience that had planted them. They were doing their work the way living things do their work. Quietly, continuously, without looking for acknowledgement, building towards something that would outlast the man who had set them there. Elmer walked the shelter belt most evenings when the season and the light allowed. Not because there was anything to check, not because anything needed managing. He walked it because the silence inside it was different from the silence of the open field. Deeper, slower, holding a different kind of time. And because when he walked the windward side, and then the sheltered side, he felt what 5 years of patience and 480 acres had taught him. That the right decision, made in the face of doubt, and held to without bitterness, has a way of becoming the landscape. He had learned that from his grandfather, who had learned it from the land, which had known it all along.